look at the internet, look at sources, but the assignments are based on the lectures. So you go back to the lectures, you can modify your answers if you want, and then just save those, and they will be submitted at the deadline. What else? Devika, anything else of broader interest? If the questions come up that are more broad, I'll pass them on to you and to Jobin if he's here. Okay, so so then I guess we have questions for from week 4 for Manjari and myself. How should we do this, Manjari? I think there are very few questions for me, Manjari. So maybe I'll just go ahead and then hand over to you.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Is that okay? And would you like me to read out your questions, or will you find them?
I have the discussion forum link.
Yeah.
And I also have an Excel, a Google sheet that was shared.
Yeah.
That has some questions.
Yes. And once you're done with those, then there'll be questions in the chat box here in Zoom. Yeah. So forgive us, all of you over there, forgive us. We are juggling multiple sources of information, multiple places where you put in your questions. So it might take us a few seconds to orient ourselves. So I'm just going to start with the questions that actually, I don't think any questions have come for me through the Google questionnaire, the form. There's again another general question from Dr. Badri about can you poll with respect to the timing of the interactive sessions? I'm afraid that's not possible, Dr. Badri. We have lots of competing requirements over here, so we tried to resolve those as best we could to decide on the timing of the interactive session. So by and large, it'll be a Friday at 4 p.m. Unless it clashes with a public holiday. And on 1 or 2 occasions, the faculty may not be able to attend, so they've requested for a shift. But otherwise, Friday at 4 p.m. I think there was a question on the discussion forum which I've answered. I hope, and if the person is there today, then they can follow up if they like. So I'm looking at the Zoom chat box. There's a question, how do we avoid bias coming into research? So there are different kinds of biases. There's a personal bias you might take. So bias is basically where there is a predisposition towards one kind of answer over another, or over to a larger or smaller measurement in one direction. And in research, I think that our primary goal and responsibility as researchers should be to find out the truth, not to discover or the question, to discover the answer that we want. So I think, and this is difficult because we usually have some preferred answer. For example, in conservation, conservationists usually come with some preconception about things. So for example, many conservationists might come with a preconception that, let's say, fire is bad for ecosystems, or grazing is bad, or collection of non-timber forest produce is bad. And all of these things may be true, but they may also not be true. And so when you, tackle a research question trying to find out, is fire bad? There are multiple things you have to think about. Firstly, what is bad? And you have to define that. And you have to also carry out research open to the possibility that you'll find the opposite, that fire is neutral in the way that you defined, or fire can actually be good for ecosystems. And increasingly, for example, we are finding that fire is a natural part of many Indian ecosystems. And the notion that we had until recently that all fire is bad and should be stopped can actually be harmful to ecosystem regeneration and persistence and diversity. And so if we are to reduce or remove the bias in our minds, then we need to, arm ourselves in various ways. The first way to arm ourselves is to recognize that we are humans, and therefore we are very likely to be biased. We are very likely to favor one answer or the other. And that recognition itself is very important. Many scientists, oddly enough, in fact, maybe some of the most the scientists that have the most strong ideas about what the answer should be would claim that they are not biased. But I don't think any of us can claim that. We all usually have some notion or the other that we prefer this answer or that answer. And so just recognizing that is the first thing, that we're humans and therefore we will have our own inherent subjectivity and bias. And then if we recognize that, then we can arm ourselves with some techniques. For example, one important technique is blinding. And we've talked about blinding, I talked about it in the lecture, in an experimental context, where let's say we have these double-blind clinical trials where neither the person administering the vaccine or the placebo, we don't know, or the control, nor the patient receiving the vaccine or placebo knows which one they're getting. And that way their preconceived ideas cannot influence the outcome of the experiment if it's done correctly. But also in observational studies that many of us do, we can also try to be blind to the situation. And again, I've described the situation in the field example I gave with the playback experiments. So you might conduct the playback experiments. The person conducting the experiment clearly knows what's going on, but a third party sitting in the lab and let's say viewing video or viewing or listening to audio could be blind to whether this video or this audio is coming from the male subject to the song playback versus male subject to control. So there are various ways. So that's a researcher bias. Then, of course, there can also be measurement bias. Your instruments could be biased to measure high or low and so on. And that's another thing to think about. So there's a lot that could be said about it. I hope this is at least just a beginning and you can think more about it and Google and search more about it. Otherwise, we'll spend all of this hour talking about bias. Request you release the transcript ASAP. Yes, we are releasing the ASAP. We're trying to make that faster. So we've got some brute parasitism questions. How can we decide we have enough data to substantiate our hypothesis? Again, you are not, please, just using the language from earlier, you are not seeking or should not be seeking to prove your favored hypothesis. You should be open to the idea that your hypothesis may be right or wrong. So the best detectives and Sherlock Holmes and all that, always keep an open mind. Once you begin to narrow your mind and say, I believe this must be right, then you cherry pick your data. You cherry pick the information that matches your preferred hypothesis or preferred model of the world. And then you are very likely to be misled. And once you decide something is true, by the way, there's a quote, and I forget exactly the exact quote, but the quote is to the extent that progress in science is made when scientists die and take their wrong ideas with them, and which means that essentially individual researchers, if they've spent 10 years or 15 years in the pursuit of one particular hypothesis or in the pursuit of one particular answer, they don't change their mind even when the evidence points the other way. And that's kind of unfortunate. So it's only after they die, then the field can move on and the next generation has new ideas. So we should all be open. There's a really interesting paper by somebody called Chamberlain. This is in the 19th century, so nearly 150 years ago, it's called the method of multiple working hypotheses. And he talks about different hypotheses as being multiple children. You are attached to your hypothesis because it's your hypothesis, like you're attached to your children because they're your children. But he tries to take that metaphor to say that you shouldn't just have one child, not just one hypothesis. You should have multiple hypotheses. So then you'll be neutral to which of those hypotheses actually turns out to be correct. But if you only have one hypothesis, one explanation, then you'll fight till your dying breath to prove that explanation correct. So let's not talk about substantiating hypotheses. Let's talk about testing our hypotheses, evaluating hypotheses, challenging hypotheses. When can we stop collecting data? That is to do with actually, this will come more in detail in a later lecture on data analysis. But for now, remember from this week's lecture about the relationship between precision and variability and sample size. So the precision of your study depends on the variability in the population divided by your sample size. And if you have a precision that's predefined, I want to and this again will come later, how you'll predefine precision, then you'll be able to see when your sample size is sufficient and you can stop collecting data. Okay. I will carry on. These are not for me. Okay, great. So hand over to Manjari then. Manjari.
Hi, Suhail. So yeah, I There were several questions in the discussion forum, which I have already replied to. So Suhail, what do you suggest? Do I go over them again, or?
No, I don't think you need to, Manjari. If the people are here and they want to ask some follow-ups, they can, or they can ask follow-up in the discussion forum itself.
So I'm guessing once I post the reply, everybody gets to see, not just the person who.
Well, it seems like not everybody knows about the discussion forum and not everybody clicks on it. So it's a good point, Manjari. Just to remind people over here, if you don't know what this discussion forum is, on your course dashboard, please go to ask a question. There's a link on the top called ask a question, and you will see there are 160 or 170 posts on the discussion forum asking questions of the faculty. So please go through those as well. Some of the responses are really detailed and rich. For example, Manjari's responses in the last week are very, very informative. So please go through those as well.
So what I will do is I will first address the questions that came in the Google Sheet, and then I'll come to the chat box. So there was one question about, about murmuration. There have been some questions, and one by Divya Pal Singh. At what point does a flock of birds become a murmuration? So a murmuration basically is not simply a flock of birds. It is when they are being when there is some amount of self-organization, and then when the flock is actually taking multiple shapes and it's moving around, and typically it is just before roosting. So there is a specific context for murmuration. It cannot be just a flock of birds passing over our terrace. That would not be murmuration. A flock of say 20 pigeons, is it a murmuration? Like I said, it has to be moving about in a self-organized way for it to be a murmuration. And it cannot be something transient, a passage of a number of birds in space would not qualify as murmuration. Then follow up to that was, isn't murmuration more susceptible to harm from an atmospheric event? So I'm not quite sure what kind of atmospheric event a murmuration can be susceptible to. But yeah, when there are large numbers of animals in one place, and if some event happens which can be potentially fatal to some, of course, much larger numbers will be affected. How to identify the breeding pair in a flock of babblers? So in case of jungle babblers or Arabian babblers, at least in Arabian babblers, there is a way to distinguish the sexes, males and females. The males have the yellow iris and the females have a black iris. In jungle babblers, even that is not there. So first of all, even determining sex is difficult. And to identify breeding pair, in case of Arabian babblers, we know that multiple males can mate with the alpha female. So, but typically it is the alpha male and the alpha female, and their dominant status is indicated by their altruistic behavior, which includes sentinel behavior as well as feeding behavior. So that is one way. Of course, copulation, we know that at least in Arabian babblers are extremely, so they do not copulate when other group members are around. And copulation anyway is not very easy to see, so that would not really be an easy way to find out a breeding pair. So it is hard to find out which exactly individuals would be the breeding pair. Also because they share duties at the nest. That was that. Then about a presentation to be given at the start of the week. There's one more on murmuration. The question is it known who initiates it? If there is a leader? So in murmurations, like I said in my lecture itself, it is not initiated by a leader. Collective behavior, other kinds of collective behavior, there are instances where there are distinctive leaders, individuals who lead the movement of the group. But in case of murmuration, there is no leader. It is not initiated by one individual or so. How many birds are needed to be present to call it a murmuration? Well, typically murmuration have hundreds of thousands of birds that join. But how many birds must be interacting with each other for this information? Like I discussed, that the behavior of an individual affects the behavior of other group members, and the behavior of other group members affects the individual. So now the question is, what is the number? So how many are you likely to influence, and from how many are you going to be influenced? At least for the European starlings, what they have found is around 7 is the number which is required when this information, this local information starts to spread. Okay, and this information is about how the individuals are moving, which direction they're taking, so on. How long can a murmuration last? So it can last for close to an hour, I mean, several minutes, first of all. But it is also something which can be disrupted by other activities around the starlings that are showing murmuration. But typically, this is just before roosting. So with respect to time period, this is when it happens, and it can last for 40 minutes, 50 minutes, something like that. Can birds who have never interacted be involved in it? Yes, they can be, because again, it is not about knowing group members in any way, or sharing information, or sharing previous experience with the group members. It is a form of self-organized behavior. And which birds commonly, so in starlings, it is most commonly studied. Then another question, in cooperative breeding, can both males or females be involved? I'm guessing you mean involved in providing care. So yes, both males and females can be involved. And even though there can be in certain species, there is a female philopatry or male philopatry, but still that does not mean that it is going to be the nest duties are going to be sex bias. There is not necessary there's going to be a sex bias in providing care. Okay, so this is what was there in the Google Sheet. So now I'll come to the chat box here. You have referred to something called allele. While explaining cooperative breeding, could you explain, elaborate? Yeah, so basically alleles are, so you, on the chromosome, we have the sister chromatids, and alleles are just alternate forms of a gene which is present on these sister chromatids. So if you have a certain trait, say for instance, eye color, the eye color can be determined. So if there is a gene that determines the trait, which is eye color in this case, the gene will have to alternate or more alternate forms, and these are known as alleles. So on the two sister chromatids, you can have the same allele, or you can have two different alleles, and depending upon which one is dominant, which one is recessive, the expression of those alleles actually take place. And when I talk about a certain trait spreading in a population, these are all theoretical models. So just to be clear, and where the theoretical models basically discuss that if there was a trait, say some form of altruism, which has a genetic underpinning, okay, and let us, is equivalent to saying, let us assume a spherical cow. So if there was an allele that or a gene that encodes for altruistic behavior, then what happens? So it is in this context that I use the term allele. So I hope that is okay. I hope that's clear. Then why do some birds lay eggs in other nests? Why be brood parasites? So it is just one alternate form of breeding system in birds. So it's just a variant form, and it works in some species. How can we decide? This was Suhail. I think this was already addressed. Do they follow leaders in murmuration? No, they don't. In fact, if you listen to the lecture carefully, I clearly mentioned that there is no leader in case of a starling murmuration. In other kinds of collective behavior, there is. What kind of recorders can be used for studying bird calls? So Chiti, Marantz definitely is the most uh, popular recorder that is used, but Marantz is just a tape recorder. You will also need a mic. And another popular mic which is used for bird call recordings is a Sennheiser microphone. Depending upon what kind of vocalizations you want to record, you will either need a directional or an omnidirectional mic. I hope that helps. And since for birds, typically their audio range overlaps greatly with our human hearing as well. So typically you will be able to even hear what you are recording. In mixed species flocks, how does group dynamics work and who follows whom? So we will have, I think we'll have one special lecture on mixed species flock. It's a very interesting topic, and one slide definitely does not do justice to this topic. So I'm hoping that you all will attend the guest lecture and enjoy it. So in mixed species flock, basically, the studies that I discussed, in that case, there are clear initiating species. There are clear species that initiate the flock, and they initiate the flock, at least in some studies we know, by vocalization. So they make particular kinds of vocalization which causes other birds to join. Other species are clearly known as what we call as joiners, which typically join once the flock has taken a certain size. So yes, there is definitely here, there is some sort of a leader, if you like. Instead of leader, we use the term initiator, rather, that's the correct term. Why are there schools of thoughts based on taxonomic nomenclature, variation, evolution of birds? I guess this is for Raja Jaipal. Maybe I'll. Suhail, is Raja?
No, I don't think he's here. But I think what we can do is post it on the forum and ask him to respond to that.
Okay.
Yeah, he's the best person to comment on it. Yeah.
Address this. While I was documenting purple sunbird nest, I saw purple sunbird feeding the hatchling, and next time the purple drum sunbird was feeding the. You saw two different species feeding at the same nest. So I don't know. I'm not sure what really is happening. Typically, I'm not aware that this can happen. Inter-species cooperative breeding, I'm not aware of that. So yeah. Does a heronry?
Ma'am, yes, ma'am. I saw both of the species in one same nest.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Maybe, yeah. So, Hale, have you ever heard of interspecies cooperative breeding?
No, not. I mean, you do sometimes get hybridization. For example, I documented once a hybrid between two different kinds of weaver birds. So a female streak weaver nesting in a male baya weaver's nest. But that's not cooperative breeding. That's one of these relatively rare instances of hybridization. So without more details, of course, we can't comment. Perhaps you could type out, in more detail what you saw in the discussion forum and let others also, comment on it.
And also, typically, just from the cooperative breeding perspective, typically cooperative breeding is within the same species. It's not across different species. So that is another thing I think you can keep in mind. Can a mixture of starling species? Yes. Typically, it's the same species, but definitely there are instances where multiple species can be in a murmuration. This definitely does happen. Does other kinds of birds apart from starling perform murmurations, or is it unique to the birds? Well, starlings, let me put it this way, starlings are the stars of murmuration, and they are the ones who are most most spectacular in, so well, we also have mynas, pied mynas and some other, but mostly typically in this group. But the European starling is one species, and the reason why I chose this as an example is because it is the most well-studied example, and definitely not limited to European starling. Murmuration is definitely not limited to European starlings. How do birds not crash into each other? Yes, also bats don't crash into each other. They have ways of avoiding. So navigation is a fascinating. So of course, for birds, there is visual control over where they are going, but at high speed, um, what people wondered for a very long time, of course, what do bats do? And just what the birds do in terms of vision is what the bats do in terms of acoustics, and it's basically sensing your neighbors and keeping a certain distance from your nearest neighbor. And that is exactly how murmurations works anyway, that you are sort of interacting with your nearest neighbors, and that is how the information spreads, resulting in the self-organization. In some mammals, females live communally and raise the cubs together, and males live solitary. Does this happen in birds? Yes, I mentioned it in one of the breeding system in the greater ani. They do have communal nests where many females lay the eggs together, and they also share nesting duties. Whether bird populations decline as a result of cooperative breeding. This I did not understand, so I request the user to the person to kindly elaborate on this. How, like, what exactly you mean by? I mean, just type it out in the chat box. What you mean by cooperative breeding resulting in decline in bird population? Are there any studies on migrant and resident bird heterospecific attraction and breeding? Yes, I mean, in migrant and resident, okay, that's
Hello.
very specific. There are definitely several examples of hybridization, and in fact, very recent paper from Peter and Rosemary Grant on the Darwin finches kind of made a lot of stir about two completely established, two different species of finches hybridizing to have a different an individual which would not breed with species A or B. So I mean, this definitely happens, but I don't know whether there is specific studies on migrants mating with resident birds. I don't know.
Hello, ma'am. Wanted to ask about that cooperative breeding. What I had understood, ma'am, when in a group, one is the breeding pair, while others are the helper, and they forego their breeding session. So, whether wanted to know when amongst 10, if only a couple is a breeding pair, and well, other are not, and the ratio of the offspring to the ratio of people to the ratio of birds which are foregoing, whether it leads to a declining trend in that particular species.
No.
And ma'am, whether the helper also at some point of time then do breed?
Yes, they can if they leave the group. I have actually mentioned all of this in the lecture, so I'm just you did listen to the full lecture, right? I mean, I do mention that there is one of the reason for helping is that you join the breeding queue. And so in some species, not in all. So one option of breeding independently is the helper actually leaves the parental group and establishes its own territory and finds a mate. And therefore, that model that I suggested, that we talked about, Emlen's model, right? What's the using the bee eaters? What is the cost of leaving the natal territory and leaving this group and establishing your own? So yes, helpers do start to breed on. They can start to breed on their own. Unlike in several eusocial insects where there are reproductive castes where individuals are incapable of breeding, in birds, helpers can breed on their own. But then why help? The point is that one of the ways in which they can become breeders is to join the reproductive queue. Once the parents or the main breeding pair disappears or dies, then they ascend to the higher rank.
Yeah, beta to alpha. Yeah, I remember. Another, ma'am, only.
I will please request you to please type in your questions, okay? And I will address them. Let's just keep it this way. It will be easier for everyone. Yeah, so that I can address everybody's questions, right? Many people have put their questions here. Please type your question. Thank you. Okay, there is something about, is there any vocal communication in a murmuration to say that there are vocally communicating, how to form? Actually, I do not know. It's a very interesting question. Somebody else also had asked this question. It's a very interesting question to me. I do not know of any studies. I wonder if there is some kind of vocal coordination that may be happening, which at least allows them to orient, if not to direct the murmuration. So yeah, it's an interesting question. The answer is I do not know. Do parent birds have preference for female or male offsprings? Not that I know of any study that has established sex bias, but definitely in there can be many different environmental conditions which can result in certain slight biases in the operational sex ratio in a population. But otherwise, usually there is no reason to believe that there will be some preference of the parents for certain sex of their offsprings. For example, if food is scarce, do they choose? No, I do not know of any such studies. Are you answering my question, ma'am? I don't know. You tell me. Also, are you planning on sharing lecture? I think I'll leave this for Devika. Shiti, oh, okay. Jobin, sorry, did I? It shows many more. Just a second. So I'll just take a moment to just read these questions. Or if Jobin, if it is easier, if you can, since you have joined, can you just help me out here? There are so many things which are not questions, but more of comments.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's one query. Okay, I got it in and out, so I don't know. Okay, so there's one query from Devendra Thakur. Is cooperative breeding instinctive, or is there any role of genes?
Instinctive would typically mean there is a genetic underpinning. So these are hardwired behavior. Learned ones are the ones in which there need not be any genetic underpinning. And cooperative breeding definitely is an innate behavior.
Okay.
So it is genetic. Yeah.
Next question is from Ashish Thagat. What is the science behind birds evolving their patterns in murmuration? Basically, how do they adjust so quickly? Are there predefined patterns which they understand?
Yeah, so it is a self-organized behavior. Information about movement of a focal individual passes to individuals near this focal individual. So there's a group of birds around this focal individual, and now each individual in turn can be the focal individual who will have another group. That is how information passes, and it is self-organized. I have also given reference to the paper, the PNA study, and if you want, I can send you through on the discussion group or through the TAs, I can send you the link to the paper. So information is passing through this system in which from one focal individuals, the effect is one focal individual affects its nearest neighbors. Each of these nearest neighbors then affect their nearest neighbors, so on and so forth. That's how the information spreads that quickly.
Manjari, the next question is for Dr. Suhail. Should I go ahead with that or?
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Okay.
I'll be reading the other questions till then.
Yeah. So how to ensure non-intrusive experimentation as much as possible so that the results reflect reality as much as possible. Anything you could share on this topic?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And let's just make a distinction between two kinds of interventions in nature. One we've called an experiment. But before that, let me also talk about something that I didn't mention in my lecture, which is what we might call an intervention in nature that's just to understand what is going on, not to disentangle cause and effect. So an example of this might be capturing a bird to fit a satellite transmitter on its back so that we can find out where it migrates to and comes back. Correct? That's not an experiment. We're not comparing treatment and control. We're not looking at cause and effect. We're just trying to understand the bird's behavior as it behaves naturally. But we can't do it otherwise. So we put a satellite transmitter, or in the past, of course, people put bird bands or rings on their legs, and then the birds might have been recaptured or killed somewhere else, and then we would get the ring returns, and we would try and understand where they've gone. But of course, the satellite transmitter system works much better nowadays. So that's an example where we're intervening, but not in an experimental context. And there, of course, we want the intervention to be as benign as possible. We don't want the rings or the satellite transmitter to be so heavy, for example, that the bird can't fly properly. Because then we won't get the right answer, right? The bird will only fly a little way, it won't go all the way where it normally goes, things like that. Or it might get killed by some predator. We also don't want the device to be too bulky, because let's say, we don't want it to get caught on branches or twigs. And so again, that hinders the natural behavior of the bird. So in that case, we want our intervention to be really as benign, as unobtrusive as possible, while still being able to track the bird. In an experiment where we're trying to disentangle cause and effect, the very logic of the experiment demands intrusion. Like the point of the experiment is to change the circumstance. Let's say we're talking about murmuration a lot. I mean, it's really interesting. So many questions about murmurations. Clearly, it captures our imagination. Now, let's imagine that murmurations, we have an idea that murmurations are more likely to happen, or they become larger when there's a predator around. Let's say we have an anti-predator hypothesis for murmuration. So there are two ways we can try and figure this out. One is we can sit near a place where starlings or whatever come to roost, and we can hope that one of those evenings that we sit there, a falcon turns up. And then we see what happens in the presence of the falcon. Now, a falcon may not turn up all the time. We may spend many evenings without seeing any falcon at all. And so all we get is the situation where there's no predator around. Even if a falcon does turn up, we have no idea whether falcons turn up under certain circumstances. Maybe falcons only turn up when there are many birds. And then we make the false implication that because we see a falcon when there are many birds, therefore the presence of the falcon has made the flocks coalesce, the murmurations coalesce into one large flock. And so actually there's no cause and effect. Actually the cause and effect is reverse. The falcons turn up when there are large flocks, rather than large flocks happen when there are falcons. So do you see what I mean? So the observational method has multiple deficiencies, multiple points where it breaks down. So the point of the experiment is, now I have, let's say, a tame falcon, and in many parts of the world, falconry is legal, and you can fly a falcon, a tame falcon, and you can see then under your experimental control what happens to these murmurations. So unfortunately, okay, but apart from that one thing, we don't want there to be other impacts of the experiment. You don't want to be walking through the roosting site, disturbing all the birds, right? Because that again negates your experiment. So everything apart from the experimental manipulation should be as unobtrusive as possible. But the experimental manipulation itself, by definition almost, would be intrusive. So I hope that makes sense. Yeah, I'll stop over there.
Thank you, Suhail. Manjari, if you're still there, the next question is for you. In cooperative breeding.
Yes, I'm there.
Yeah. In cooperative breeding, whether the group is helper of the group, leader, or what, who decides upon who will be the breeder and who will be the helper? I think you've already answered this one.
Yeah, the one who comes first. The parents. would be the breeders, unless they disappear or they die, or
All right.
typically it's the offsprings who are the helpers, right?
So the next question is, could you kindly elaborate more on what a failed breeder is in context of cooperative breeding?
Yeah, so a failed breeder can be someone that fails to find a mate in that breeding event or season. That does not mean it is incapable of breeding. So may have failed to find a mate, may have had a nest failure, or may not have been able to find a suitable territory to be able to attract a mate, anything. So in that breeding season has not been. So it is a reproductive adult. First of all, it must be a reproductive adult and has failed to secure mating or failed to raise its chicks.
Okay. So the next question is, what is warmer together hypothesis in collective behavior?
Yeah, so the hypothesis is like Suhail was saying, that when you have a question, you come up, or there may be existing hypothesis. There can be more than one. And one of the hypotheses for birds coming together as a mixed species flock is that it is to attract birds, and even for murmuration, that it is to attract them to join a larger become a larger group, such that they will be when they are roosting together, as there will be many more birds joining a particular roost, it will become warmer. But this was tested and there has been no support for this. So when they roost together, you may have seen birds clumping together, and definitely you must have seen penguins doing this. So therefore they can stay warm together, just because they are minimizing heat loss if they are closer together. So larger the group, the hypothesis posits that warmer it would be, and this could be one of the potential function of animals joining such large groups. But like I said, it was tested and there was no support for this.
Okay. So there's one query from Devendra Thakur. Is Khalij pheasant monogamous, or do they show monogamy?
I don't know. I don't know, but there is this wonderful resource. Suhail, they just need a eBird account, I guess, right? For birds of the world, on where they can look at all of these information about birds on the website, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm just typing the address in the chat. It's birdsoftheworld.org, and anybody in India has free access, but you have to create an account. You have to create a free account. So if you have any, like an eBird account is the most common one. So if you go to ebird.org, I'll also type that and create an account and log in at Birds of the World with the same username and password, then you can get that. And then if you search up Khalij pheasant, then pretty much everything that's known about Khalij pheasant will come up in that in Birds of the World, and similarly for all the birds of the world.
Yeah. And I think there was something about any app for vocalization. That too, I think eBird does give vocalizations for many species, and for some species there are multiple kinds of vocalization. That again, I would say you should definitely visit eBird. You will be able to hear the vocalization. I think it's a very nice interactive platform.
Yeah, just sorry, Vanjali, the app is called Merlin. I will type the name in the
okay.
Merlin app for and it does automated photo recognition, and soon we'll also have automated sound recognition in Merlin. So you record a bird's call and it will tell you what it is, or at least some of our species.
Wonderful. Yes.
So should I go ahead?
Yes, Chobin.
Yeah. So there's a query from Reshma. Is there recording of copulation in mixed flock? I'm not sure what that means, but yeah.
I don't know. Maybe,
okay.
I don't know.
Yeah. What is the Sachin Yal from? He has a question. What is stimulation and role of murmuration in life of a bird?
Function of murmuration. That is what those various hypotheses were, right? So, like I said, that we There are several hypotheses that have been put forward for collective behavior in animals, including joining mixed species flock, for murmuration. For murmuration, of course, one of the biggest contender was the safer together hypothesis and the warmer together hypothesis. Warmer together simply because murmuration happens typically before roosting. So these were hypotheses that have been put forward. There are not enough studies, but there are studies who have tested these hypotheses, and that also has been discussed in the lecture. You can go back to the lecture, everything has been discussed there.
Yeah, I think the next question is about the warmth benefit in mixed species. So that's already been answered.
That is also, yeah.
Yeah. So then
There is the lecture. Please
yes.
listen to the lecture.
Reshma is asking, during birding, I can come across Munia using abandoned nest of weaver birds. Do birds use other birds' nests?
Yes, they do. In fact, even for cavity nesters, we know there are primary and secondary cavity nesters. Some who build, and some who reuse them. So yes, they do.
The Nanesh is asking, what is increased foraging benefit in mixed species flocks?
Oh, yeah. So increased for foraging benefits come from multiple ways. I'll explain two. One way is that they can simply eavesdrop on other individuals in the mixed species flock to see where there is more food available, potential for food, and go to those patches. So therefore, their foraging, that is direct benefit coming from the information that they gather. The other benefit is not dependent on information about where food is found, but more coming from the vigilance point of view. When a bird is foraging, it must also keep an eye out for predators. And if there are other individuals that are keeping a watch, then it can spend more time foraging than keeping a watch constantly. So this comes from the many eyes hypothesis, which is true for many collective kind of behavior, not just for mixed species flock, but also for cooperative breeders, also for those individuals that are gregarious and forage together in larger numbers.
Okay. So this next question from Ashish, I think has already been answered about predefined patterns of for murmurations. I'll go to the next question. Do starlings have any physical adaptations for murmuration?
Not that I know of.
Okay. Tahir Ahmed asked, is there a purpose, for example, if a pair of birds simply sitting on a branch for a long time? Okay, he saw two white-bellied seagulls on a branch for some duration. Okay.
Maybe they're just waiting for food, I don't know.
Cooperative breeding. So Sriram Iyer is asking, is cooperative breeding genetic? Is it something that evolved because of environmental factors? Will non-cooperative breeders become cooperative or vice versa over time? Is there any
Actually, it's a very good question, Shriram. The evolution of cooperative breeding has been examined not just in birds, but also in fishes. And the short answer to this is that it has evolved in certain groups, been lost, then again. So it is a trait that has evolved, then got lost, then has come back again. So it's the answer is not that straightforward. And this is true not just for birds, but also for fishes and some other groups of, so there are mammals that are cooperative breeders. So this has been looked at in them as well. So it is not that under these kinds of environmental conditions, cooperative breeding would occur. However, it has been proposed, and there is some evidence from meta-analysis that species that inhabit harsh environments, typically arid or semi-arid environments, are more likely to have evolved cooperative breeding. And of course, the answers are very adaptationist. So it is harder to find good territories, and therefore more likely that the offspring will stay back in the natal territory, so on and so forth. All those hypotheses we have actually discussed in the lecture. So yes, certain environmental conditions seem to be more conducive to a cooperative breeding, although it has not been established that this is what leads to cooperative breeding. No.
Okay, I think the next question, Manjari, is for Suhail. How invasive are, I mean, as a part of it's already been answered. How invasive are experimental studies for bird offsprings? For example, if you add some eggs, add some artificial eggs, etc., is there a chance of the bird rejecting all the eggs?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a chance. This is in any case, any situation where you do these kinds of experiments and manipulations. And of course, there are very good reasons to do your work so that the rejection of eggs doesn't happen, all eggs. One is, of course, the ethical imperative. No, we should try to do no harm to our subjects. Sometimes, depending on your question, you may have to harm them to some degree, but in general, that's our default. No, we don't want to cause them any harm. And the second thing, of course, a reason to avoid that happening is that it ruins your experiment. If you're adding some eggs and want to see what the bird does, and instead it just abandons the nest, then your experiment is not working. It turns out that and the second point is that when, especially in the context of nests and offspring, there's an interesting phenomenon, that is when at the very early stages of nesting, birds and mammals and others for that matter are more sensitive to disturbance. And as nesting progresses, the chicks hatch, the chicks become older, they become less and less sensitive to disturbance. So the same disturbance that might cause birds to abandon their freshly laid eggs may not cause them to abandon the chicks. So you can think about why that might be so, why birds may be less sensitive to disturbance the more time passes in nesting. But generally, birds seem to not be very sensitive. And that's the reason why so much work has been possible to be done on bird eggs and chicks and the entire nesting cycle. So if you just ensure that you go quickly to the nest, do your egg, put in your artificial egg or something like that, and quickly come back, ideally try and time it when the parents are away. That's sometimes not possible. But if you adhere to some basic things, then they typically don't abandon their nests. The story that we've all grown up hearing, that if you touch a chick or an egg, the bird will abandon the nest, that's not true. If it were true, then a large number of studies that have been done would not have been able to be done. But of course, we do want to minimize any and all disturbance for those two reasons. One is the ethical reason, and one is, of course, the scientific reason.
I think there's one more question. It's already 5, so should I take like 2 more questions? Would that be okay?
Maybe we can go another 5 minutes. We started about 5 minutes late.
Okay, so the next question is there any record of cannibalism in birds when food is scarce? Could birds eat their own kind?
So I don't know who that's
addressed to.
That's addressed to. There is occasionally, but I can't remember the details. Yeah.
Okay. The next question is from Manjari, I think. Can group of flightless birds like penguins coming together against predator be called as murmuration?
So, see, collective behavior in birds is broadly referred to when they are moving together in flight, is broadly referred to as murmuration, although it is specifically referred or rather more generally referred in the context of starlings that make those really interesting shape. But it doesn't have to be just that. It could also be geese that are migrating and making some certain interesting patterns and shape. They can also be, but it has to be in flight is what I understand of murmuration. Flightless birds, penguins, this is would come under the broader category of collective behavior, but not murmuration, I would say.
Nayanesh is asking for a bit more explanation about the handicap principle for babblers.
Okay, I'll come back to that at the very end because this has been explained in great detail in the lecture itself. And if we have time, then I'll come back to this. Can I take other questions very quickly so that I can save some time for this?
Okay. Nanesh has again asked, can you explain recently hundreds of blackbirds collapsed from the sky in Mexico? That
I
came in the
don't know.
recent. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know enough.
Srinivas is asking, why only some starlings murmurate? Do all starlings murmurate, and why not other species?
Like I said, different species of starlings murmurate, and it is not just the European starling, but the European starlings are the ones who have been most widely studied. Now, why do some species show certain traits? For example, the same question can be asked about brood parasitism. Same question can be asked for certain other kinds of behaviors like cooperative breeding. This is how biology is. There's an inherent variation. Okay, and that does not mean that it has to be adaptive. It does not mean there has to be certain kinds of benefits that has to be that can be drawn, and which can only be drawn by a certain group of species. So we should not look at everything from a very strictly adaptationist point of view. Okay, that there will be a certain larger role for this. Okay, so this is inherent variation in biology. There are some species that show certain traits and some other species that do not.
Devendra Thakur asks, is there any preference shown by birds for particular vegetation or flora for their nesting?
Yes, very much. Almost, well, many species of birds have very specific kinds of plants on which they are dependent for building their nests. So, for instance, yeah.
Sorry. So Srinivas is asking, do some starlings, I think he means individual starlings, keep away from murmuration, or all compulsorily participate? Do all compulsorily participate?
No, they don't have to compulsorily participate, but so they can also be, in fact, okay, you must also understand that while the murmuration is ongoing, there can be a bunch of starlings that can just break off. And it's not that they decide or choose to leave the group. It is just the way the organization of this behavior is. It is self-organized. So you are doing something and your action affects those who are near you. And this effect can result in some of them getting left out or going towards the edge and breaking in a certain direction where the rest of the group does not move. So it goes out. It's not that it is consciously leaving. Okay, I'm not happy with this group of this murmuration. I will go and join something else. It's not like that. So there's nothing compulsory, and there's no hard feelings about leaving a murmuration either.
Okay. Sriram is asking, I'll ask the first, locust attacks, is this murmuration?
It's swarming behavior, yes. Let's not call it murmuration, but it is a form of collective behavior, and it's known as swarming behavior.
And he also asked, does penguin breeding count as cooperative breeding?
No, cooperative breeding is, well, again, explained it such great details. Clearly, I've not done a good enough job, but no.
Okay. There are two more questions. Are yellow-footed green pigeons monogamous? I think, or chances to cheat on their mate when they're, yeah.
I don't know.
That can be found in any bird, I think.
But you can read up about them on Birds of the World.
Yeah. How migratory birds know when they have to start their migration?
There will be a lecture, Suhail, right, on migration, I hope. There's a special lecture, right?
Yes, there'll be a lecture. I don't know if they'll, Dr. Suresh will talk about the mechanisms, like the physiological mechanisms. So very briefly, you can say that it's a combination of things. Most often, day length, change in day length causes hormonal changes in the physiology of birds, and that's when they know that it's time to migrate. But of course, that's a single sentence answer, and there's a lot more complication to it.
Okay, I think there was a last question, which is very similar to the locust one. Fish school count as murmuration? Question mark. No. Okay. Yeah, I think we're done with
it's a type. Murmuration is just one form of collective behavior, and collective behavior includes pooling of fishes, migration of land mammals. It includes swarming of locusts and murmuration. That these are all different forms of collective behavior. Murmuration typically is for birds that make these really interesting forms just before roosting. So they have to be in flight. They have to be birds, and you cannot have a bunch of flying foxes showing murmuration. So that is also not valid. Okay.
Yeah. And I think there's an appreciation by Krishna Priya. So thank you very much. We're delighted to be here with you and discuss with you. There was also some compliments and criticisms further up, which of course Jobin didn't read. Those weren't questions. But please do give your feedback in the feedback forms, because that's the mechanism through which we can collate everybody's experience and their thoughts on how it's going. I should also say that this course I think is quite unique among the NPTEL courses. It's taught by so many, 6-7 faculty, plus several guest lecturers, and the reason for that, of course, is that everybody has their own area of expertise. And so the kinds of things that Anand Krishnan spoke about, or that you'll hear later, or Manjari, I can talk about, or Manjari can talk about, but we won't be in any way as authoritative as they can be, and vice versa, the things that I speak about. So that's the reason to have this collection of faculty. And the consequence, of course, is that everybody has their own style, everybody has their own manner of teaching, and that may or may not be suit you. So it's a trade-off. You get some advantage, there's some disadvantage in terms of lack of uniformity in the way of style of teaching. So I think with that we'll end. Yeah. Anything else? I think we're all done. Devika, with the green signal from you, we can close the recording and end the live session. Maybe Devika's not here. Yeah, Devika says yes. Okay. Thank you, and see you next week. Bye, everybody.